Welcome everyone to our very first corporate strategy IG webcast. My name is Patia McGrath and I'm an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina in beautiful Chapel Hill. I will be moderating our discussion today, and part of my role is to help ensure that you, our audience, can join in on the conversation. So you should see a Q&A button probably at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This button opens up a window that is your direct line to us. Please type your questions in the Q&A window whenever you like. I'll be keeping my eye on the Q&A box and will aim to get your questions answered. Now, I would like to introduce the stars of our show, our four distinguished panelists who have so kindly agreed to share their time and perspectives with us today. I am absolutely delighted to introduce Guoli Chen from INSEAD. Guoli, hello, good evening.
Hello, good morning, I think, right?
Good morning, that's right.
No, good morning to you and good evening for me.
That's right. John Joseph from University of California, Irvine. I know it's good morning for you, John.
It definitely is good morning here. Yes, well, glad to be part of the session.
Thank you. And Caterina Moschieri from IE University. Good afternoon, Caterina.
Hi, thank you for having me, and congratulations on the first webinar.
Yes, it's so exciting. And last but not least, Başak Topaler from Kadir University in Istanbul. Good afternoon, Başak, or should I say good evening? I guess that's closer.
Almost evening, yes. Hello. Good morning to you. I'm really happy to be here participating in the panel today.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. For our first webcast, which is officially titled Global Perspectives of Business Academia, we wanted to tap into the international experiences and interests of our IG membership. So we decided that having a conversation around potential similarities and differences in academic life around the globe would be a great place to start. Now, since academic life begins with the PhD experience, perhaps we can kick off our discussion there. And maybe we could start by talking about PhD programs. And a question I've always wondered is, when students first join your PhD programs, what is their typical experience level? Do they have work experience? Do they come in with master's degrees? Is that expected? Or perhaps from undergrad? I've seen a lot of variance around the world. Caterina, may I start with you? Could you please share the typical profile of a PhD student entering your programs in your neck of the woods?
Absolutely, with pleasure. So I actually am in Madrid. So in Spain, there are some very good business schools. I'm in Instituto de Empresa y Business School in Madrid. And although the business school belongs to a university, the PhD belongs to the business school. So it's a bit of an atypical situation, but we have our own PhD program. We select a cohort of students that ranges around 6 to 10 students per year. And we typically get them out of a university degree in Europe, which normally is 5 years. And sometimes they have a couple of years of work experience.
Okay.
And our PhD program lasts 5 years. So in Europe, there has been a Bologna reform a few years ago. So we have 2 years of coursework, which would grant the students a diploma. It's a Master of Science, which is called the Master in Research. And then we would have 3 years of research where the students actually devote 100% of their time to developing their dissertation and to work with one professor specifically, the thesis director. These 3 years normally include the third year of the job market. So it's 2 years fully dedicated to research and then 1 year dedicated also to the job market.
Very interesting. Okay, so Guoli, in your experience, are there similarities with what Caterina just said? Or is the student profile and program perhaps a bit different?
So right now I work in INSEAD, and the INSEAD's PhD program, I think it's pretty similar to the PhD program in the United States. So it's very research oriented, and then it's going to take like 5 years, perhaps at the minimum, and sometimes it takes like 6 years. So I will perhaps lift this kind of like typical PhD students profile to like the John, for instance, because INSEAD's PhD program is very similar to the PhD program in most of the US schools, like your schools. I would like to perhaps say a bit about the PhD program in China, because
Please.
I am originally from China, and it looks like perhaps I'm the only one who can cover this region, right, the Greater China areas. And so in China, I think the PhD programs I think in the past, like for instance, 5 or 6 years ago, they typically, I mean, the top schools in China, they might admit around like 8 to 10 PhD students in the strategy departments, which is, compared to INSEAD, right? We only have like 3 PhD students, 3 to 4 students admitted a year. But in China, like perhaps more than 50% or 60% of the PhD students, they might graduate but do not like pursue that further academic life. So they are more like the DBA type of things, and then work in the MNCs or maybe the state-owned enterprise, and then only like 30 or 40% of them continue their academic life. And nowadays, I think in the last several years, I think there's I would like to say there's a sort of the convergence of, or the influence of the US PhD programs on those like top schools in the United States. So they restructure the PhD program to make it very similar to many US PhD programs, typical like 2 years of the courseworks, and then starting from the 3rd year work on the dissertation stuff. So it's good nowadays. The top schools in China, they also have like 4 or 5 years of the PhD program. The students need to take like at least 4 or 5 years to complete the PhD program. And I think compared to INSEAD, I think most of our PhD candidates, they have the master degree. And in China, I think at least maybe 40% of them, 50% of them, they may start right away from the undergraduates and then go to like 5 years, like including master and the PhD program. So I think here there's a big difference between the typical Chinese PhD program, I mean in Chinese university versus like INSEAD or some US schools PhD program.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it's also interesting how you mentioned that in the Chinese programs, things have begun to change a little bit, molding perhaps. So Başak, if I may turn to you, because your background is fascinating. For your PhD, if I recall correctly, you went to Sabanci, which is, the traditional school, if I may characterize it that way. But at Kadir, where you are currently, that's a relatively new school. And so you had the decision as to how you wanted to run your programs, if you wanted to model it after an old way or a new way. Could you share a bit about what PhD programs are like and what the students, what their profiles are like?
Sure. Actually, the Turkish higher education field is a very much regulated field, regulated by the state, and it's centrally governed. So there are some uniform bylaws regulating the graduate studies in general, including the doctorate programs as well. And according to those regulations, for instance, you could enter into the PhD program with or without a master's degree, but the requirements differ. If you start with a master's degree, it's typically 4 to 6 years, the PhD program. If you start without a master's degree, it's higher, like 5 to 7 years type of. So it's typically 2 years of coursework followed by 2 years of dissertation process. Most of the students enter the PhD after they get their master's degrees. But there's a major shift between universities in Turkey. There's a small cluster of most Americanized, let's say, US modeled cluster of public and as well as private universities who are more oriented towards US models, US archetypes, and they do their instruction fully in English, for instance. This is a small cluster, and Sabancı is among the one of part of that cluster. And there are typical Turkish universities on the other side, although their origins are in the continental European models, the French and the German particularly. These two clusters are kind of different, and the US modeled ones are more research oriented. For instance, the PhD program that I went through was a full-time research-oriented program where all the students were accepted on a scholarship basis. They were required to publish at least one article in an international outlet before they graduate. So this is very much research-oriented. But in terms of duration, it's 4 to 6 years typically.
Very interesting. And, thank you for bringing up the funding model that, some they can be expected to be accepted with a scholarship, whereas others may not have that luxury or privilege. So John, if I may turn to you, and with any of our experiences, currently you're at UC Irvine, but you've taught at a number of different places. So if you could please share what you've seen in terms of PhD programs, student level of experience, and whether or not they get funding when they start.
Yeah, so, having been most recently at Duke, and which is a East Coast private small institution, and now Irvine, which is a large California public institution, some of my comments are informed by the distinction between those two.
Yeah.
I would say in general, and my experience also coming from, I got my PhD at Kellogg, it very much, there's a lot of convergence actually, and I think Guoli sort of mentioned this among U.S. programs, in that, I think the typical age tends to be mid-20s to late 20s. I think that econ-y type programs tend to probably attract younger students, because the econ, programs often get students right out of a undergrad program. So I think those tend to be younger, less likely to have a master's or an MBA, and maybe even no work experience. But by and large, I think folks do come in with a few years work experience, which, by the way, I think tends to help in a business school management program where they're going to be teaching most likely MBAs. So in terms of that translating to success, I think that matters. In terms of the funding, it varies. That's where it's interesting. I think you see a lot of variation, and I encourage prospective PhD students to ask very carefully and understand exactly what they're going to be getting in their package, both in terms of monetary compensation or stipend. Usually tuition's covered. That was true both at Duke and UCI, for example. But what begins to be very different is, for example, housing, and the degree to which they have to teach. This is vastly different. In some schools, you'll have basically no expectation. And others, you'll have, it's part of the funding. When you come in, there's an expectation you'll be doing certain hours. So I think that's probably one of the biggest differences between the two.
For any of you, a difference, and I'm not sure if this is a global difference or just school specific, when students are accepted, are they accepted to work with a particular professor? So in some cases, perhaps you're hired to work in the behavioral lab, and then you are tied to that lab and that professor's interests, or is it more independent, if you will, and you're just accepted, and wherever your interests go, you can follow them. So John, if I may just follow up with you on that, are students typically hired in to work with a particular professor, or is it more freeform?
So typically in the recruiting, faculty will sit around and, make decisions partially based on who do we think they could work with, right? Is there someone here ideally more than one person that this PhD could be working with based on all the materials that the PhD sent in. So we do, in fact, I think, look for that. Once they're in, the idea, it's true at Irvine, less true at Duke. There is an assigned person, faculty is assigned to each PhD student. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of a informal mentoring, something to get them started, something to get them familiar, somebody to keep track of them.
Yeah.
And then more importantly, somebody to get them involved with a research project right away from day one. Something that is complementary to their coursework, something that's not too burdensome, but something that is going to get their hands dirty with research and data right away. So then as they progress in the program, then I think the informal networks take over. I think the personal interests, those sorts of things, and then people naturally gravitate and are encouraged to gravitate toward faculty with whom they have a strong interest.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's great that they have that support, coming in and the organization. Caterina, how about at IE? Is it, are students assigned someone? Are they required to work in a particular group? Or is it just open?
It works exactly as John described.
Hey.
It's exactly the same thing. Students have some flexibility to change their minds. While they are exposed to courses, they may like a specific topic that they did not know before, or maybe they may bond specifically with one professor or one area of research, and these may push them in that direction. But the idea is that the faculty is involved at the beginning to select students who could be potential collaborators, co-authors with faculty members. So one thing that maybe didn't come through clearly from my explanation before is that because our PhD is attached to the university, although it sits in the business school, at the end of the first 2 years of coursework, we give a Master of Science, which in Europe is a legally valid diploma. So it's more than a university degree, and this is why we kind of highlight this part, because for us it's important that we got this accreditation, because it differentiates us from other options in Europe or in the United States. The diploma that is legally recognized in Europe, together with a PhD which is in the American format, in the US format. So we kind of managed to blend the two things at the same time, which I believe is pretty unique in the continent here.
Yes, but you get the best of both. So
hopefully.
Yeah. And Başak, is it the same that it's free-form students perhaps have guidance, a mentor and assigned person, but they're not required, they're not financially tied to a particular professor in any way?
Actually, it's more like a free flow here, I guess, compared to what they were mentioning, because students first go for the coursework in the first 2 years, then they should pass, of course, the proficiency exam,
yes.
And then typically in practice, they start thinking about their research topics. I think this is a little bit late, but this is what happens in practice. They start thinking about their research topic, and then they have, of course, they build up their interests over time while they were taking the courses, but the time that they start thinking about their research seriously is that part, and they then try to negotiate with the professors so that they can align their interests with their interests to come up with a common point and to select a professor to go with.
Yes. Well, it's great that they have the chance to get exposure to course material, get a sense of what they might like, and then they can decide. And Guoli, I'll just finish up with you. Is it similar? Are we converging in this arena, or are there some differences?
In INSEAD, it's exactly like what John said. It's like a free market or like two-sided matching process. But in China, most of the school, like the Greater China area, including Hong Kong, actually, I think maybe most of the school that when the students are admitted to the PhD program, they more or less know who they're going to work with.
Right.
I think this is related to Caterina's points about the funding, right? So like, for instance, in INSEAD, if the funding is from the school, it's not from a specific professor, then there's no, no bonding between the professor and then the PhD students. But in China and even sometimes in Hong Kong, I think what I heard is like the professors or the advisor that they may chip in the tuition, right? So maybe like 30% or 40% of the tuition, or maybe the fellowship or scholarship are from the individual professor. In that case, actually the students are very clear that once they start the PhD program, they are going to work with a specific professor. Then it's not so easy to switch to the other professors, other colleagues. But again, I think in the most recent years, for the top schools like in like Peking University, they try to like switch from like the typical traditional way toward the American style, that there's the free market. So they're going to have the first year coursework, and then they are open to have this like free labor market of the two-sided matching.
It's very interesting. It's fascinating to hear there are some strong similarities, but nuances as well amongst each of you. So moving from the doctoral experience and going forward a little bit in time to more of the job hunt and the interview process and so forth, just for our audience, because it may not be clear to all, to get our labels and our vocabulary straight. So John, you had done this in one of your responses. You delineated between public schools and private schools in the US, and private is also a independent, some people may call them an independent school. And Başak, could you say a little bit about, is there the same private-public distinction in Turkey? How does that work?
In Turkey, philanthropic foundations are allowed to establish not-for-profit foundation universities, which we call as private, but actually they are not for profit and should be established by a foundation. The difference between the public and private is that basically private universities are governed by lay boards. They charge tuition to the students, which they freely determine the amount. And their employment relationship with their staff is contract-based, but in public universities, it's like a civil service. So there are major differences between public and private universities, but by law, establishment of for-profit universities is not possible. So any university cannot be profit-seeking in this context.
Interesting. And Caterina, in your corner of the globe, is it basically the same public-private distinction, or there are more nuances? And how does this tie to accreditation? Can both public and private schools, there's the alphabet soup of AACSB or EQUIS or whatever. How does that all tie into the school type, if it does?
So I guess that in most of Europe, including Turkey, Başak, if I'm correct, you can have both private and public, and both type of institutions can be accredited by EQUIS and the SORT. Here in Spain, the biggest difference is whether you are accredited by the government of Spain, so by the Ministry of Education, which means that the diploma that the university issues is legally valid. So we are an accredited institution, but imagine that we were not. We would be able to issue a 5-year university degree that would have market value, but if at some point you wanted to apply for a position as a civil servant in Spain or in another European country, that would have no legal value. So it's only, if we did not have the accreditation, the value of our diploma would be only as good as the reputation of the school per se. While because we are also an institution accredited by the government, our diploma also is equiparated to a public university diploma. So you have the standing of a private institution with the reputation that comes with, if it is good, and then the legal validity. So we, as professors, we have the private contract, as Başak explained, because we are professors of a private institution, but we do the public system accreditations. So, for example, if I want to teach in the PhD program, I need to pass some exams designed by the Spanish Ministry of Education. And only if I pass those exams, I can teach in the PhD students. If I want to supervise PhD students, I can only sign their diploma if I have passed some of these exams, and so on.
That's very interesting. Guoli, be it in China or Singapore, what types of models have you seen? Is it public-private still? And
I think in Asia, perhaps like maybe I a bit like over-exaggerate, but in Asia, like in China or in Singapore, I think literally all the top schools are public schools, and then the private school, it's more like recent phenomenon. So literally all the public schools got the accreditation from the Ministry of Education. So like both in Singapore and China and Hong Kong, INSEAD itself, of course, it's a private school. So nowadays, similar to what I said before, like those Chinese schools, they call internationalizations. It's not like company globalization, but they want to increase their international reputation. So nowadays, they quite a few schools actually put themselves into the like AACSB accreditation, so that it could be like internationally recognized. But in Asia, like in China, Hong Kong, Singapore, literally all the top schools are public schools.
That's very interesting. And so, John, I certainly don't want to get into a debate in the U.S. if it's public versus private, because there are, I think there's excellent schools on both sides. In terms of accreditation, just to be clear for our audience, something like AACSB accreditation, a school can earn that whether or not it's public or private, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I think the real distinction in whether this even is significant to faculty or PhD students is whether it's a top tier institution or not. You know, the schools like HBS or Wharton or Kellogg or Chicago, whatnot, really don't pay too much attention to it. Actually, it's really kind of irrelevant. I would say once you fall out of the top 20, then it becomes, I think, a signal. Because they want to make sure that they send a signal, that they have a signal other than the sort of the B school rankings, that they're sort of a legit institution and that, they check all the boxes. So I think that's where you see the real big difference. In terms of PhD students, I don't think it affects them at all, other than, and if, within reason, I think any school, I would imagine top 50, certainly probably top 100 has this, because it's almost like a baseline for lower ranked schools to make sure they have it, whether it's public or private.
Makes sense. And just to close out our discussion around different schools, so if folks are thinking about joining an institution, now they have a little sense of what differences there may be. I'd like to ask you all about the interview process. So a PhD student or a professor, they're looking to join a academic institution, because I've heard that there's some striking differences. So, in my own experience, in mostly US schools, there's a job talk, you go for the day, you interview with everyone, and it's on a more of an individual basis. But I've heard that some models, it's actually they bring all the applicants in, and you kind of have like a big interview day together. So if you all have interesting examples around that, do you have differences from the standard interview day? Where it's an individual day? Have you seen a group model at all? Any of the panelists? It's all the individual.
I just happened, the only school I know that actually occurs, I think Peter Merman, I was having a conversation with him. Peter was at the Australian Graduate School of Business or Management, and he just got a job at St. Gallen. Yes. And I think he told me that this was this model where you're in a group and, they're having a group conversation. That's the only time I've ever heard of it. It's a bit of an outlier, I think.
So it does exist. You know, as we all can recall our job market days, I bet we were wishing for just a single day where you get your answer pretty much immediately of all the other applicants. So moving from, you know, the interview process, you've gotten your job, you've picked your institution. Can we talk a little bit about the teaching experience? And this can range from classroom dynamics. We talked a little bit about in what language classes are taught. We could talk more about that, but class formats, lectures, case discussions. But while some of this may be school specific, it may actually, there may be some more cultural drivers as well. So if you could please give a sense of classroom dynamics, class structure, the types of students that you may be teaching, that would be wonderful. So would anyone like to kick that off? Or I can cold call. I'll cold call Caterina, if I may cold call you as our IG leader.
I'm going to be one of those students who always has the hand raised. So our students are mostly foreigners. So I think that actually we have a cap on the number of Spanish students that we take in the business school and in the university. But I know most of the business school. I know very little of the university. They are in another city, and if they are in Madrid, they are in another building. So I don't have much contact with the university. So in the business school, we have mostly foreigners. Some of these are from South America. So our MBA courses, we cater about 800 MBA students a year. Then we have the Global Executive MBA, the AMP programs, and the sort. But for the majority of any type of students, we have essentially English-speaking courses. Most of our professors are non-Spanish, in fact. We teach in English. We sometimes have some groups of students that are Spanish speaking, but this does not mean that they are Spaniards. Most of the time they come from South America, but this is really the minority. So as an international professor here, you can stay in the institution for decades without teaching one session in Spanish if you want.
And in your MBA program, is it small classes, like say 20 students, or is it the big lecture halls? What is the typical style?
So we have our let's say our our value proposition is that the layout of our MBA classrooms is limited to 54 seats, I think.
Okay.
So we can never have more than 54 students by logistical design. So classes are either 54 or smaller, depending on whether they are in the later on in the MBA program.
Okay. So you still have that close community style, and if you want to do a case discussion or what have you, it's small enough to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So John, if I may turn to you, especially at UC Irvine, because if I'm not mistaken, it's actually quite a large school. Do you have large lecture style classes, or is it the more tight-knit class that Caterina was describing?
I mean, it depends on the program, and I think U.S. business schools fall into two. Some have undergrad programs and some don't. Business schools with undergrad programs, those tend to be much, larger.
Yes.
And often I think PhDs coming in, junior faculty coming in who either are not comfortable teaching MBA or maybe have not had the chance to teach in their PhD programs will often be put in an undergrad setting to give them a chance to, not be in front of an MBA audience, get their feet wet and that kind of thing. I would say class size for the MBA programs or master's programs or even exec ed programs don't tend to get that large. I would say they range anywhere from maybe 40 to 70 students in a classroom here, typical style. But this doesn't even differ. In fact, our classes at Duke were larger than the ones, the MBA classes were larger than the ones that we have at Irvine. So I would say the bigger difference is on the undergrad than on the master.
That makes sense. Now, Guoli, I know that INSEAD does not have an undergrad program, so I'm guessing that your MBA classes are similar to what we've been describing. You know,
Yeah.
not too big and not too small. But in China, is it similar? Do they try to keep classes small? Is it case style?
Um, well, I maybe I do not have the classroom experience to teach in the Chinese universities. So my understanding, it's like for sure the undergraduates is still the major audience or major participants for most of the schools or most of the junior faculty's teaching load. And over the time, they need to teach MBA and also some of the executive teaching. And my understanding is like the major challenging part is to teach the executive MBAs who are in the age of like the 40 plus. And one of the unique challenge to teach this group of people, especially in China context, is like in the last 10 or 20 years, there's a lot of like new business or economic development in China. And if, for instance, if I got my education, typical like the PhD degree from the United States, and then I start my career in like Peking University or Tsinghua University, then when I teach a group of executives, like our EMBA audience there, and I may not understand what exactly happened in China because everything happens so fast.
Right.
I cannot like go to search the Harvard Business Case Center, and then lots of cases are, I think maybe less than 1% of the case is related to Chinese companies. So
Right.
lack of this context understanding will make the teaching specific challenging for the junior people who start teaching like the MBA or executive MBA
Yes.
or executive program. So this is what I heard about it. I can imagine it could be challenging because again, on the one hand, it's just a lot of new things happen in China. On the other hand, if we take a look at the inventory of the cases or the knowledge that we have, perhaps it's difficult to get the help from colleagues or the case center. Like in INSEAD, it's MBA program. It's one of our flagship programs. So for the core course, our class size is kept at around like 70 or 72 because of the classroom design. But for the elective, and then we are kept as 48 students. And most of our faculty, I think, once they get promoted and they start teaching the executives, then we tend to shift the teaching load from the MBA program to the executive program. And for the executive program, I think generally the class size is less than 30 or 35 to ensure sufficient amount of interaction. And then the workshop style so that they can apply, they can discuss their own business in the classroom.
Yeah, the workshop style, that can be very powerful for students themselves. Başak, if I may ask you, and Guoli mentioned the difficulty of having case material. If you could share your experience, what you've seen in terms of class size, the type of content that you're sharing, that would be great.
Yes, the same, the China case, of course, applies to the Turkish case as well. We have difficulties in finding materials from our own context. But again, there is a major split between this US modeled American style universities versus the typical Turkish university. In that cluster, those universities do their instruction in English. They try to be competitive in the international arena as well. And although their students, most of them are Turkish, there's not much internationalization in that sense in terms of global students. At the MBA level, we do have students from abroad. For instance, in our program, in my university, half of the students come from abroad, for instance. They are foreigners. And we do our instruction in English. Doing it in English makes it difficult for us to make an extensive discussion within class, especially at the undergrad level. It's purely lecture, but then at the MBA level we try to do case discussions. At the PhD level, of course, paper discussions come into the picture. In terms of class sizes, the MBA classes at most 30 students, I would guess.
That's a nice size, yeah.
Yes, in the executive MBA as well. But in the undergrad level, it depends. In public universities, sometimes huge class sizes can be observed. And in private ones, it's smaller. So in my courses, for instance, if it's an introductory course, it's typically 50, 60 students. But if it's an elective, it's sometimes 15, 20 students. So it depends. It varies across universities and public-private distinctions.
And certainly when you're teaching the massive seminars, you feel like you're an actress on a Broadway stage, because there's so many people. But it's a different dynamic. We do have a question from our audience. Larry asked, how much teaching experience do your PhD students get during your PhD program? So Başak, if I may, just since we were just chatting, if I may start with you, do your PhD students, do they have the opportunity to teach?
Actually not. They don't teach typically. They just do research assistantship. They do some teaching assistantship in certain instances, but they are not required to teach, and they are not expected to teach indeed, because even in the postdoc stage, I know that the course load is at most 1 in a year, as far as I know. So they are not expected to teach at the PhD level.
And Caterina, you had mentioned special certifications and so forth when we were chatting about teaching earlier. Are your PhD students, are they allowed to teach? And what would typical course loads be?
So we pay them a scholarship that covers their tuition fees and a stipend. And we expect almost nothing in exchange for it, eternal gratitude. And apart from this, they are not expected to teach. However, if on the late stages of the PhD, they desire to gain some teaching experience, they can reach out to the university and they can apply to teach some courses. I think that there is kind of a bidding style type of selection, and they can. Otherwise, we have no requirement for teaching.
Very good. And John, at Irvine, do PhD students teach, perhaps at the undergrad level, or?
Yeah, so I actually like to make a distinction between the need and the desire. I think those two things tend to be a bit different. I think a lot of students want to come in and they want to teach, which is good. It's part of the job. They need to, frankly, be good at it, reasonably good at it, at least, to ensure that they don't, that they have a long and happy career. So they can't go to the classroom their whole life and not want to do it. So I think it's good to have that. There is, however, no requirement that they do. And I would argue that, in some cases, it is probably a good idea for a student to gain experience. It varies. If you have a student coming in, they have an MBA, they worked 2 years at a consulting firm, right. They're very fluent in English, they present really well. You know what? They probably don't need to teach because they're going to do fine. I mean, they need TA experience and stuff like that. If there is a deficiency on one of those things and you think that it's going to be a struggle for them, then yes, it's probably a good idea that they get their feet wet. The other thing is too, some schools will look for teaching evaluations. And I honestly don't know if it's becoming a trend that's becoming an expectation that they at least teach one. But beyond that, I wouldn't, that would be the maximum, meaning that they don't teach one a year, meaning they teach one class before they graduate, just so they have those teaching evals.
Makes sense.
And yes, I'm sorry, just typically we would put them in an undergrad program. And by the way, that's going to be a big difference between schools with and without undergrads, because they're going to have more teaching opportunities as a result.
Yes, and that's a wonderful lead-in. So Guoli at INSEAD, there is no undergrad program. And are there differences between Singapore and France? I thought I understood that in France there actually may be some regulations against students teaching, though I may have misheard that rumor. But do PhD students teach?
No. So first, there's no major difference between France and Singapore. So in terms of the PhD program, about 50% of our students is based in Singapore, and another 50% is in France, and then they are encouraged to do exchange between two campuses. And in terms of teaching, because first is we do not have undergraduates, and then at the MBA they pay such a higher tuition fee, they will not feel happy as a PhD students. And they are having the fellowship, which is literally there's no application for them to teach. But I fully agree with John's points. It's like although the program itself did not require them to teach, or the fellowship doesn't require them to teach, but to have a bit like teaching experience will help them in the job market. So how to mitigate this potential weakness for our PhD students, because we do not have undergraduates, right? So first, we definitely encourage I think this nowadays we have the requirements that the PhD students, they need to take certain MBA courses. So they have sit through the certain subjects, right? Like in the strategy PhD students, they need to sit through the core strategy classes of our MBA program, and they are encouraged to work as a teaching assistant. And so literally just help the professors to do the grading, or sometimes have the tutorial sessions, and so that at least they can write something on the CV that's like they have certain exposure to teaching. Otherwise, sometimes the employer, the next school, that when they are on the job market, they may ask the question, do you have any experience on teaching? Yes. So get some exposure could be helpful. Fully agree with John's points.
So I think that's a great takeaway for our audience today around, even if it's not required, try to get that teaching experience in as a PhD student. So Larry, I hope that answered your question. And please, as a reminder, everyone should feel very comfortable. Just type your questions in the Q&A box and we'll try to get them answered. Just to close out the conversation around teaching, so folks can get a sense of different experiences at the faculty level. If you take a typical assistant professor at your institution, how much are they expected to teach? And I know it may get complicated with credits and so on and so forth, but if you could just try to characterize in broad terms what the expectations would be for a typical assistant professor. And Guoli, if I may start with you.
Okay. Again, because we do not have the undergraduates, so we start with the typical MBA program. In terms of the teaching hour, I think we are similar to, in INSEAD, that we are similar to like in the US, like a 3-0 type of arrangements. But a bit unique things for INSEAD is like, because in general, it's very difficult for the junior faculty to open a new course with the multiple section, right? Yes. So here, this is a kind of the, except for the core course, for the elective, this is the market mechanism. So like we offer a new course, and then whether it could be really launched depends on how many students bid for your course, right? So if you offer a course, then if you can got one section, actually it's not bad, especially for the new faculties who join us. So I think the challenge for us is like maybe for the first year open a new course, and then you can get like one section, and over the time, either that you have to like increase the popularity of your course, and then so that you have the chance to get like multiple sections to fulfill the load, or we have to open another elective, maybe in the second year or maybe in the third year. So this is the challenging part. I think INSEAD's teaching environment's a bit challenging, but I think the school tends to design certain systems to protect the junior people. So the contractual loads is, like I said earlier, it's teaching hour-wise is similar to 3.0. I think nowadays for the first 3 years, I think the system, we design a system which is helpful for the junior faculties. I think there's major reduction, maybe about reduce of the 30%. So similar to like 2.0 in the first 3 years to make sure that our new faculty can survive in the first few years. and over time, I think over the time we tend to cover certain special things that we can put in the executive program, and then so eventually we will move from the MBA program to the executive program. First 3 years is typically very challenging, and then but the good things of the school is protective. They reduce your teaching load by another 30%.
That's great. So there's that balance, but it's interesting that assistant professors may be designing their own courses and so forth. Caterina, so the typical assistant professor experience, are they expected to design courses? Is it what would a standard load look like?
So our standard load is very similar to Guoli's description. One thing which I find beautiful in the business school here, and this is probably the reason why we have a high proportion of women among the faculty. So considering that we are a business school, we have 25% of women, which is twice as much as the normal average. And I think is that the Dean of Faculty grants you a lot of flexibility in choosing what to teach and where to teach. So if you prefer to spread your teaching along the whole year, but in few sessions per week, you can do that. If you prefer to concentrate it, you can concentrate it. If you prefer to teach MBAs or executive MBAs or executive education, you have flexibility there as well. And one of the other questions that we had in the draft that you sent us is whether you have online options, and we also have pure online courses and blended courses. So if at some point, for whatever reason, you prefer to teach online, you are given that option as well. We actually, in my corridor, we are mostly women with young kids and working spouses, which is kind of exceptional in our industry. And I find this arrangement extremely easy, compatible with personal life.
That sounds very much like a gold standard, what you just described. Başak, Caterina mentioned online options. How heavy is the load for assistant professors? Do they have to design classes?
Actually, interestingly, it is also regulated by the law for public universities, at least the minimum requirements for teaching. For faculty members, it's 10 hours a week at minimum. It's like 3 courses per semester. For lecturer and instructors, it's like 12 hours a week, like 4 courses per semester. In private universities, it is there's pretty much variance, because more research-oriented ones try to make the course load minimum. So, for instance, in Sabancı, it's like 2 courses per semester, at most 5 courses in a year. But junior faculty do start teaching in MBA, so there's not much such a difference. Maybe in executive MBA there may be some difference, but usually course load varies depending on the research orientation versus more like the commercial orientation of the university, so to say. So that depends on that orientation, I believe.
Yeah, that's a big difference for sure. So John, with UC Irvine, typical loads that folks might expect as an assistant professor, is it pretty much the same as we've been hearing?
It varies a little bit based on the contract that you come in with. Typically, and I think this is true for a lot of big public schools, it's a 4. Instead of 3, you're basically teaching a 4. You teach one more. A requirement of the UC system is actually that you teach in 2 terms. So one of the things I think that there's a big difference is the number. 2 is the ability to stack. Meaning that, and I think this is important for potential, for junior folks coming into a junior faculty position is, can you stack them all, like Guoli mentioned 3-0, or
Right.
do you have to spread them out? We have a requirement that we must teach in at least 2 terms. So that the other factor is, are you on a semester system or are you on a term system? And that makes a huge difference, right? You're with these students maybe 10 weeks on a term system,
Right.
which is not long.
Mm.
But a semester is a whole different ballgame. So because we're on terms, we have to teach at least in 2 terms. And I would also think the other big difference is I will say the intensity of the students that you are
Yes.
teaching, because, there's a big difference, and it's worth asking, when folks are interviewing, what's it like in the MBA classroom, because you have on the one hand, very, very demanding students. Certainly Guoli experiences that. Certainly that's true for like INSEAD students, I would imagine. Much less so for some of the schools. Certainly Irvine would be an example of that, where the students are, I think, much more, they're just easier to teach. So I think that's something to consider for folks when they're citing, not just the number.
That is excellent advice. Terms versus semesters and the intensity of students. That's a very good thing to try to detect ahead of time. Before we close out the webinar, I do want to just quickly touch upon the research experience. And it all comes down to money. So I'm very interested if you could please share what funding models are. Does the university provide you research money? Do you have to go out yourself and get grants at the national level or from different organizations? How might that work? So if I could just do quickly a round robin with each of you. Başak, may I start with you? So for your research monies, do you have to seek them out, or is it just granted to you? How does that work?
In very few private universities, they do provide you some research grants. The university provides it. Other than that, you have to find from the National Science Foundation through writing project proposals, and the EU grants, preferably, if you can get them. Yes, you ask for the EU grants. So this is the typical way funding from the university. But starting from this year, it changed. Now we are trying to get funds from the National Science Foundation and EU.
Yes, it can change sometimes.
Unfortunately.
Caterina, how about for yourself at your university? Do you look for EU grants? How do things work?
So we get 2 conferences paid for by the Dean's office. And we have a research assistant in the department, which we share. But apart from that, if you have any other needs, either you ask the Dean office, like a spot market situation, or you go out and you search for your own funds through national, regional, or supranational means, and that is it.
Fair enough. And John, differences that you see maybe between UC Irvine and Duke, so folks can get a sense, or?
Yeah, no difference really. We get a stipend, which is usually more than enough for the basics. And then, if you have special projects or special needs or extra conferences that year, then you go to the dean and you plead your case, and usually they're pretty good about that. I will say that for the students, this varies a little bit in terms of what these schools cover. So for example, in some cases, a PhD student will be given a certain amount of money, which basically covers, say, a conference a year or something like that. Others require, if you are presenting a paper, they will cover it. So this, I find, there's some variation there for the students.
That's a great point. Guoli, in Singapore, funding models, it's similar perhaps to what John just described, or?
Yeah, in INSEAD, it's pretty similar, like what John said. So typically for the conference travel or small amount of money for like research or hire the research assistant, I think in general, internally we can provide sufficient amount of funding, because we're the business school, right? We do social science. We're not running a lab, right? We need the millions of the dollars to buy the equipment. But if just in case that, you know, some research really need perhaps like $500,000 or, you know, the million, this amount of money, perhaps we need to like try to seek for the external funding resources. Like, you know, like in Singapore, there's a government's Ministry of Education, like tier 1 or tier 2 research fund. Typically they cover like, you know, big, I think for the social science, a big amount, like $500,000, right? And in China, similarly, I think they have a similar to an INSEAD fund that people can apply. In Hong Kong, it's very similar. But for the business school like us, I think the smaller money travel conference, it shouldn't be a problem, like in INSEAD or many Asian schools in here.
Excellent, thank you. We are at the top of our hour. We did get a breaking question that I want to acknowledge. So Dawn, who is from Singapore, she is asking about research teams that you may need to assemble for a grant. And she's asking about the composition of the team. Does there need to be a very renowned PI with no PhD students, for example? I'm not sure any of your experiences if you've had to assemble a team for a grant, but if anyone has, could you speak to Dawn's question about the grant application team and what the composition of the team should look like?
Maybe I can chip in a bit, because in the past I have a friend who is again in Singapore, and then so he applied the research funding from the Ministry of Education, and then it looks like, yes, it's good to organize as a team, and then have a couple of the team member who have the strong CV, and they have a long list of the publications, and then to show the experience, to give those like government officials who do not do the research, and sometimes they didn't do the research. So what they are really looking for is the signals. So try to put out a team of the experienced people and then create the long list of the CV. I think in general helps. It's not only in Singapore, but also it helps in China or in Hong Kong, especially if the person who make the decision may not a pure academic person.
Yes. No, it's an excellent response, Dawn. I hope that answered your question. If nothing else, it's a good example of signaling fury. Perhaps there's a research project in there. But we are at the end of our webcast. This went by very fast. I hope that everyone enjoyed it. I certainly did. I learned a lot. I'd like to extend my thanks to Başak, Caterina, John, and Guoli. Our first webcast, I think I can declare it a success, and it was a success thanks to all of you. I also want to extend a big thank you to Robin Chan from the SMS office. This webcast absolutely could not have happened without all of Robin's hard work. So with that, I will officially close the webcast. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a good day or a good night, depending upon where you are in the world. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Patia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.